She stood at the edge of her 3-acre field on the morning of the 200th day, and the smell of earth was so rich it made her eyes water. Not the sharp chemical tang of fertilizer from the store. Not the dusty dryness of the soil that had been here when she arrived. This was something older, something alive. The neighbors called it the smell of rot. They held their noses when they drove past her gate. They rolled up their windows and shook their heads and called her the garbage woman. They laughed at her methods. They called her foolish. They said a woman her age should know better than to play with trash. But on that morning, as the sun rose over Millbrook County and lit up the long rows of black gold she had built with her own 2 hands, Clara Miller knew that something was about to change. Something that no one in this town could ignore. She had come to this plot of land 18 months earlier, after her husband Daniel passed. He had always talked about a piece of earth they could call their own, a place where the soil ran deep and the mornings were quiet. When she found the old Henderson place at auction for a price she could barely afford, she thought it was the answer to a prayer she had whispered every night for 3 months. The house was small but solid. The barn needed a roof, and the land looked like it had given up, 3 acres of clay and dust, the kind of ground that cracked in the summer heat like a broken puzzle. The previous owner had pumped it full of chemicals for 20 years, growing corn until the soil was exhausted. The extension agent came out on a hot August afternoon, took 1 core sample, and shook his head. He told her the organic matter was less than 1%. He said she would need 5 years and $15,000 in commercial amendments to make it halfway decent. He said she should consider gravel and a nice garden bed instead. He said with a smile that was meant to be kind that some land is just too far gone. Clara had looked at that dead earth and seen something else. She saw potential. She saw a body that was starving, not dead. And she knew, deep in her bones, that the answer was not in a bag from the supply store. The answer was in the waste, the scraps, the things everyone threw away, the peels and grounds and shells and leaves that held the memory of life. She had read about it in the old books Daniel kept in the basement. The farmers before the chemical age had done this. They had fed the soil with what the soil had grown. They had closed the loop, and she decided, standing on that dead clay in the August heat, that she would do the same. She started on a Tuesday in March. The air still had a bite to it, and the trees were bare against the gray sky. Clara walked to her neighbor's door with 5 empty buckets and a simple question. Would they save their vegetable peels? Their coffee grounds? Their eggshells? She would collect them once a week. She would take it all away. She would turn their garbage into something that mattered. Mrs. Patterson from next door looked at her like she had lost her mind. She said, "Clara, honey, we have a trash service for that. They come every Tuesday. Why would you want our garbage?" But Clara looked her in the eye and said, "Because your garbage is going to save my farm." Mrs. Patterson handed over the first bucket. That was all Clara needed. 1 bucket. 1 yes. 1 small act of faith in a town that was ready to laugh. By the end of the first week, she had 7 households. By the end of the first month, 23. She drove her old pickup truck every Tuesday and Friday, the bed filled with plastic buckets that rattled and clanked against each other. She had a system. Green buckets for vegetable matter, blue buckets for coffee grounds and eggshells, white buckets for paper and cardboard. She labeled them neatly with a marker and kept a ledger in the glove box, writing down every address, every color, every week. She was building a network of waste, a web of renewal, 1 bucket at a time. The neighbors watched from their windows. They talked at the diner on Main Street. They said Clara Miller had gone strange after Daniel died. They said grief does funny things to a woman. They said she was collecting garbage because she couldn't let go of anything, not even a banana peel. They smiled when they saw her at the grocery store. They asked how she was doing, and then they turned away and whispered. Clara heard the whispers. She saw the way people crossed the street when she walked into the hardware store. She felt the sting of their judgment every time she loaded another bucket into her truck. She saw the looks the teenagers gave her, the smirks, the rolled eyes. But she had a vision. She could see the end of the road. Even when the road was covered in coffee grounds and onion skins, she could see black soil. She could see green plants. She could see the look on their faces when the garbage woman proved them all wrong. She built her first compost pile behind the barn on a Sunday afternoon in late March. The sky was clear and the air was cold enough to make her breath visible. She laid down a bed of straw and began to layer food scraps from the green buckets, brown leaves and shredded paper for carbon, a sprinkle of the old soil to introduce the microbes. Then she turned it. With a pitchfork that had been Daniel's, the wood worn smooth by his hands, she turned that pile every 3 days. She watered it when it got dry. She covered it with tarps when the rains came too hard. She stuck a thermometer into the center and watched the numbers climb. She treated it like a living thing because it was. The smell was not pleasant in those early weeks. That is the nature of decomposition, life breaking down so that new life can rise. Anaerobic pockets would form and release a sour, sharp odor that carried on the wind. The neighbors complained. Mr. Henderson from 2 lots down drove past with his windows rolled up, shaking his head and muttering. The Carters, a young couple who had moved from the city, called the county once, saying there must be a health violation in storing so much rotting food. The inspector came on a Thursday. He looked at Clara's neat piles, turned with scientific precision, covered and managed. He told the Carters there was no violation. He told Clara, quietly, that he had never seen compost managed so carefully by a homeowner. She thanked him and went back to turning. By day 60, she had 3 piles going. Each one was 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall. The centers steamed in the morning chill, rising in ghostly columns that Clara would watch from her kitchen window while she drank her coffee. She knew the thermophilic bacteria were doing their work. She knew the pile was reaching 140 degrees, killing pathogens and breaking down the material. She could feel the heat radiating from the core when she turned it. She could see the color changing from a messy slop to a dark, uniform mass. She could smell the shift from sour decay to the sweet, musty promise of earth. Her daughter Sarah came to visit on day 73. She drove 3 hours from the city with her husband and their 2 children. She stood at the edge of the composting area and tried to hide her concern, but Clara could see it in the tightness around her eyes. She said, "Mom, this is a lot of waste. Don't you think you're taking this too far?" She said the neighbors were talking. She said people were calling her mother the garbage woman. She said it with love, with the gentle worry of a child who has seen a parent suffer loss and fears they are unraveling. She said, "Dad would have wanted you to be happy, not to spend your days in trash." It cut deeper than any neighbor's whisper. It cut because it came from love. Clara looked at her daughter and saw the same fear she saw in the town. The fear of looking foolish, the fear of doing something different. She took Sarah to the barn and showed her the books. She told her about the soil tests. She showed her the numbers, 1% organic matter. She explained that for thousands of years, farmers had built soil exactly this way, with what was available, with what was free, with what others threw away. She spoke with a passion that surprised them both. Sarah hugged her before she left. She didn't say she understood, but she didn't say stop either. And Clara held that hug in her memory for the next 127 days. By day 100, Clara had collected from 47 households. She knew every family's eating habits. The Robertsons ate a lot of bananas. The Chen family always had eggshells and tea bags. The Garcias gave her the most vegetable scraps because they cooked every meal from scratch, 3 generations in one house, and their buckets were heavy with onion skins and pepper stems. She had become an invisible thread in the community, connecting their waste to her work. They didn't know it yet, but they were all part of something growing. They were all feeding the soil, even as they laughed at the woman who carried it away. The physical toll was real. Clara was 52 years old. Her shoulders ached from lifting buckets that grew heavier as the weeks passed. Her hands were permanently stained with the tannins of coffee grounds and the dark juice of rotting vegetables. She had blisters that turned to calluses, thick and rough across her palms. She woke before dawn on collection days, loading the truck in the half-light, her breath visible in the cold air. She fell into bed at night, with her muscles burning and her mind racing with calculations. Carbon-to-nitrogen ratios, moisture levels, turning schedules. She lost 10 pounds. Her clothes carried the faint scent of earth even after washing. On day 120, the Millbrook County Tribune ran a small piece on page 4. Local woman turns trash into treasure. Neighbors skeptical. It was not a flattering article. The reporter, a young man named Brad, focused on the complaints, the smell, the buckets, the unusual behavior. He interviewed Mr. Henderson, who said the property values were dropping. He interviewed Mrs. Carter, who said it was unsanitary and attracted flies. He interviewed 2 teenagers who called her the garbage lady and laughed on camera. He did not interview Clara until the last paragraph as an afterthought. She told him, standing by her piles with Daniel's pitchfork in her hand, "Soil is not dirty, soil is alive, and I'm going to prove it." The article made the laughter louder. People she didn't know stopped her at the grocery store to ask if she was the garbage lady from the paper. Teenagers drove past her farm and honked, shouting things she pretended not to hear. Someone dumped a bag of actual garbage on her driveway one night in May. Kitchen trash mixed with broken glass and dirty diapers and things that had no place in a compost pile. She cleaned it up at 5 in the morning, separating what could compost from what couldn't, her hands shaking with anger and grief, and she cried only after she was back inside. She cried for Daniel. She cried for the cruelty of people who did not understand. She cried because she was tired, and then she washed her face, made her coffee, and went out to turn the piles because she did not stop. They laughed at her methods. They called her foolish. They said no good thing could come from a pile of rotting peels and old newspapers. They said she was wasting her time. They said she should sell the land and move to town. They said a woman alone couldn't fix what chemicals had broken. Clara kept a journal. Every day she wrote down the temperature of the piles, the weather, what she had collected, how the texture was changing. She noted the first appearance of white fungi on day 45. She noted the first earthworms on day 62. By day 150, the first pile was ready. She screened it through half-inch wire mesh, shaking it until her arms burned, and what fell through was the color of dark chocolate. It smelled like the forest floor after rain. It was light and crumbly and held moisture perfectly. She filled 40 bags and stacked them in the barn, and when she touched them, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. She still had 2 more piles cooking. The second pile was on day 90. The third was on day 60. She had created a conveyor belt of life, a factory of renewal, running on nothing but waste and willpower and the stubborn refusal to quit. She had turned their garbage into gold, and she was the only one who knew it yet. On day 180, she spread the first batch, 3 inches deep over half an acre of her dead field. She raked it smooth, working it gently into the top layer of clay, her boots sinking into the amended earth. Her arms shook with exhaustion. Her back screamed. But she stood up and looked at that dark blanket covering the earth, and she felt a peace she had not known since Daniel was alive. She was feeding the soil. She was feeding the future. She was giving the land what it had been denied for 20 years, a meal, a chance, a memory of how to be alive. She planted on day 185, heirloom tomatoes, peppers, beans, squash. Seeds she had saved and traded for, varieties that were made for flavor rather than shipping. She planted them with her hands, pressing each seed into the amended earth with a whisper of hope. She watered them from the rain barrels she had set up. She mulched with straw, and she waited. She waited the way a mother waits. She waited the way a believer waits. She waited with her hands in the soil and her heart in her throat. The first green shoots broke through on day 192. Clara knelt in the dirt and wept. They were strong. They were dark green. They were not the pale, struggling seedlings she had seen in the garden store parking lot. These were plants that knew they were wanted. These were plants that had been given a home worth growing in. They were growing in soil that had been kissed by 200 days of love. By day 200, the neighbors had stopped honking. They had started slowing down, because the half-acre that had been dead was now a wall of green. The tomato plants were 6 feet tall and loaded with fruit that hung heavy and green, beginning to blush with color. The bean vines were climbing the poles she had set, heavy with purple blossoms that smelled like honey. The squash leaves were the size of dinner plates, dark and glossy, spreading across the ground like a green tide, and the soil between them was not the cracked clay they remembered. It was black, it was rich. It looked like it had been plucked from the bottom of the oldest forest in the world. It looked like something that had never been dead at all. But the real moment came 2 weeks later. Dr. Elaine Foster from the State Agricultural Extension Office had been following the story. She had read the Tribune article. She had heard the talk at the university where she taught soil science. She had seen the pictures that people were sharing, the impossible green of Clara's field against the brown of the surrounding land. She drove out to Clara's farm on a humid July morning with a soil probe and a testing kit. She took 12 samples from the amended field. She took 3 samples from the unamended edge. She told Clara she would have results in 10 days. Clara waited. She had waited 200 days for the compost. She had waited years for this land. She had waited a lifetime for something to believe in. She could wait 10 more. The results arrived on a Tuesday. Clara opened the envelope at her kitchen table, the same table where she had planned this journey. She read the numbers once, then twice. Then she set the paper down and walked outside to stand in her field. The organic matter had gone from less than 1% to 11%. The cation exchange capacity, which measures how well soil holds nutrients, had tripled. The nitrogen levels were in the optimal range without a single drop of synthetic fertilizer. The phosphorus and potassium were balanced. The pH was perfect. The biological activity, measured by a respiration test, was off the charts. Dr. Foster had written a note at the bottom in her careful, scientific handwriting. "This is some of the best soil I have tested in 20 years of practice. Whatever you are doing, keep doing it. This is exceptional." Clara held that note in her hands and looked at her field. The tomatoes were ripening. The peppers were turning red. The sun was warm on her face, and she knew the war was over. She knew the laughter had died. She knew the garbage woman was gone, and in her place stood a woman who had done what the experts said was impossible. Word spread through Millbrook County like it was carried on the wind. The garbage woman had turned her trash into soil that scientists were calling exceptional. The same neighbors who had held their noses were now driving past slowly, their windows down, trying to see the magic. The same teenagers who had shouted at her now stood at the fence, silent, watching her work with something that looked like respect. The same people who had crossed the street at the hardware store now stopped to ask her questions. They wanted to know how. They wanted to know if she would teach them. They wanted to know if she would sell them some of that black gold. Mrs. Patterson came over on the first Saturday after the news. She brought a cherry pie, warm from the oven, and she stood at Clara's fence and looked at the field with wonder. She said, "Clara, I saved my peels for 200 days, and I never understood why. Now I think I do." She asked if she could buy a bag of the compost. Clara sold her the first bag for $25. She called it Clara's black gold, and Mrs. Patterson took it home and spread it on her roses, and within a week she was telling everyone at the church social that she had never seen such growth. By the end of that month, Clara had a waiting list of 43 names. People from 3 counties were calling. The Robertsons wanted 10 bags for their raised beds. The Chen family wanted 5. Mr. Henderson, who had complained about property values and called her names in the Tribune, sent his son to pick up 8 bags and didn't make eye contact when he handed over the cash. The Carters, who had called the county inspector, came with a smile and bought 4 bags and asked if she would consult on their garden. Clara took their money and showed them how to start their own pile. The county fair came in August. Clara entered her tomatoes in the heirloom category. They were judged on size, flavor, and appearance. She won first place. The judge, a man who had been farming for 50 years, asked her secret. She said, "I fed my soil what others threw away. I gave the earth time to remember how to be alive. I treated it with respect, and it responded." He shook her hand and held it a moment longer than necessary, and she saw in his eyes the look of a man who had witnessed something true. The Tribune ran another story. This one was on the front page, above the fold, with a photograph of Clara standing in her field holding a jar of her soil. Garbage woman's soil tests stun experts. Neighbors line up for BlackGold. The reporter Brad apologized for the first article. He said he had seen the test results himself. He said Clara Miller had done what agricultural science said would take 5 years and $15,000. She had done it in 200 days, with buckets of trash and a pitchfork and a stubbornness that refused to bend. He called her a pioneer. He called her an inspiration. He called her the woman who taught a town how to see. Clara's phone rang constantly. She hired 2 local teenagers to help her screen and bag the compost. She expanded her collection to 62 households. The city council, which had once fielded complaints about her, invited her to speak at their sustainability meeting. She stood in front of them in her work boots and her faded flannel shirt, her hands still stained from the work. And she told them that every town in America was throwing away the solution to its problems. She told them that waste was not waste. It was just resources in the wrong place. She told them that the soil was a bank account, and for 20 years the previous owner had been making withdrawals without a single deposit. She told them that all she had done was make the first deposit. She told them that anyone could do it. She told them that the old ways were not backward. They were the only way forward. By autumn, Clara had sold over 1,200 bags of compost. She had cleared enough money to fix the barn roof and buy a small tractor that she named Daniel. She had 3 acres of the richest soil in the county. She had a waiting list that stretched into the next spring. She had invitations to speak at 2 gardening clubs and 1 agricultural conference, and she had something more valuable than any of it. She had her dignity back. The garbage woman was gone. In her place stood a woman who had taught an entire town how to see. Sarah came to visit again in October. She walked through the field with her mother, the children running between the rows of late pumpkins and winter squash, their laughter echoing across the land. She picked up a handful of soil and let it run through her fingers, watching it fall in dark ribbons. She said, "Mom, I understand now. I really do." Clara didn't say anything. She just put her arm around her daughter and watched the sun set over the land she had brought back to life. The sky was the color of ripe peaches and old gold. The air smelled of earth and harvest and home. The neighbors who had mocked her now brought her their scraps with pride. They didn't call it garbage anymore. They called it their contribution. They called it their share of the black gold. The Carters, who had called the county inspector, now had the best flower beds on their street. Mr. Henderson entered his tomatoes in the fair the next year. He came in third. He told everyone he owed it to Clara's compost. He told everyone she was the real farmer on this road. He told everyone she had saved the soil, and in doing so she had saved a little piece of all of them. On the 250th day, Clara stood at the edge of her field again. The harvest was in. The soil was resting under a blanket of cover crops, crimson clover and winter rye that would feed it through the cold months. The air was crisp and clean. She held a jar of her soil in her hands, the same dark, rich earth that had been tested and celebrated. She thought about the 200 mornings she had loaded buckets, the 200 evenings she had turned piles, the laughter she had swallowed, the tears she had shed, the blisters, the backaches, the loneliness of being misunderstood, the fear that she was indeed a foolish woman playing with trash. It had all been worth it. Every bucket, every insult, every moment of doubt, every morning when she wanted to quit and didn't, because she had not just built soil, she had built proof that the old ways still worked. Proof that what others discarded could become the foundation of abundance. Proof that a woman with a vision and a pitchfork and an unshakable faith in the cycle of life could change the chemistry of the earth, and in doing so, change the minds of a town. She had built a bridge between the waste and the wealth, between the mockery and the miracle, between the garbage woman and the soil scientist they now called for advice. They had laughed at her methods. They had called her foolish. They had called her the garbage woman. But the soil does not lie. The soil remembers. The soil holds the truth of every hand that has touched it and every gift that has been given to it. And on that quiet morning, as the cover crops swayed in the autumn wind and the jar of black gold sat warm in her hands, the soil spoke clearly for all to hear. It spoke in the language of life renewed. It spoke in the language of patience rewarded. It spoke in the language of a woman who would not be broken. Sometimes the things we throw away are not worthless. Sometimes they are simply waiting for someone patient enough to see their worth. Sometimes the old ways are not backward. Sometimes they are the only way forward. Sometimes the woman they call foolish is the only one wise enough to listen to the earth. Sometimes the soil that looks dead is only sleeping, waiting for the right hand to wake it up. The soil was alive. The town was changed. And Clara Miller was home.